HOA president was caught using $20,000 of community money for personal bills. The discovery shook the entire community to its core. It started quietly when the HOA accountant noticed inconsistencies in the financial reports, amounts that did not match the budget, and transfers that were unexplained. At first, the accountant assumed it was a mistake, a clerical error that could be corrected with a few phone calls. However, as the review continued, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Multiple payments had been made from the community account to personal credit cards, utility bills, and even loan payments, all linked directly to the HOA president. The total was staggering over $20,000. This was not a small oversight or a miscalculation. It was clear that funds intended for community maintenance, landscaping, and repairs had been diverted for personal use. News of the findings spread rapidly through the neighborhood. By the time the board called an emergency meeting, the community hall was filled with concerned residents. People whispered in clusters, some shaking their heads in disbelief, while others tried to understand how such a thing could have happened. The president appeared at the front of the room, greeting everyone with a nervous smile that failed to hide the tension in the air. For years, he had maintained an image of integrity and leadership, but now that image was cracking under the weight of undeniable evidence. The auditors presented their findings with precision. Line after line of transfers was displayed, each showing payments made for personal expenses. Residents leaned forward, staring at the spreadsheets, murmuring in shock as they realized the extent of the misuse. It was not just one or two small errors. The pattern had been ongoing for more than a year. Families who had been waiting for repairs on playgrounds, sidewalks, and fences now understood that their money had been used to pay someone else's credit cards and loans. Questions erupted immediately. People wanted to know how this could have gone unnoticed for so long. Were there others involved? Could the money be recovered? The president attempted to explain himself. He said the payments were temporary advances and insisted he planned to repay the funds. He argued that he had acted with the community's best interest in mind, claiming the transfers were part of administrative flexibility and that everything would be made right. His words fell flat. The residents were no longer willing to accept vague excuses. The proof was before them, and no explanation could erase what had been done. As the meeting continued, neighbors shared their own experiences. An elderly resident recounted how she had asked for repairs to the community walkways months ago, only to be told the funds were unavailable. A young couple with small children expressed frustration that the playground remained unsafe while the president was living off the community's money. These stories illustrated a pattern of neglect and mismanagement, reinforcing the evidence presented by the auditors. Tensions rose as people realized the depth of the betrayal. The board decided to suspend the president immediately pending further investigation. An external auditing firm was hired to conduct a full review of all financial activity, and a special meeting was scheduled to discuss possible removal from office. The president left the hall quietly, but the residents remained, talking amongst themselves late into the evening. Conversations revolved around how to prevent such incidents in the future. People discussed stronger oversight, more transparency, and ways to hold board members accountable. The sense of betrayal was tempered by a growing determination to reclaim control and ensure the community was protected. Outside the hall, the mood was a mix of shock, anger, and determination. Neighbors who had never interacted were now exchanging information, sharing documents, and discussing ways to monitor the audit. Some wondered whether the $20,000 was only part of the problem, and others speculated on whether there had been misuse in previous years. Despite the tension, there was a newfound sense of unity. People who had been passive were now actively engaged, realizing that oversight and participation were the only ways to prevent corruption in their community. By the end of the night, it was clear that the HOA and its members had reached a turning point. The $20,000 was not just a financial loss. It was a wake-up call. Residents recognized that blind trust in leadership could no longer exist and that vigilance was necessary to protect the community's assets. The president, once viewed as untouchable, now faced scrutiny, suspicion, and accountability. The future of the neighborhood would depend on how residents organized, demanded transparency, and ensured that such a betrayal could never happen again. This was only the beginning of a long process to restore faith, repair relationships, and reclaim the community from someone who had abused their position of power. The audit had revealed far more than anyone had anticipated. What had begun as a discovery of $20,000 in misused funds quickly expanded into a tangled web of financial manipulation that stretched back several years. The auditors spent days sifting through hundreds of documents, cross-checking bank statements with invoices, receipts, and utility bills. Every time a new irregularity was found, word spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Conversations that had once revolved around small complaints about landscaping or minor rule violations were now dominated by discussions of accountability, ethics, and how someone could abuse a position of trust so blatantly. Residents who had previously avoided HOA meetings now found themselves drawn in. Families crowded into the community center, some standing in corners, because there were no chairs left, all eager to hear updates from the auditors. People whispered to one another, comparing observations and trying to make sense of the situation. A mother of three recounted how her children's playground remained unsafe for months while the president claimed funds were unavailable. A retired teacher noted that the sidewalks she had complained about for years were cracked and dangerous, yet now it was clear the money to repair them had been redirected into personal bills. The frustration in the room was palpable, mingling with a sense of disbelief that someone in a position of authority could betray the entire community so thoroughly. Meanwhile, the president's attempts to manage the fallout became increasingly desperate. He sent out carefully worded emails emphasizing transparency, responsibility, and his dedication to the neighborhood, but each message was dissected and scrutinized by residents. People noticed inconsistencies, vague phrases, and outright omissions. Some members of the board, previously loyal to him, began questioning his motives in private conversations. Whispers turned into discussions, and discussions turned into action plans. The community had transformed from passive observers into active participants determined to reclaim control of their finances and their trust. The auditors continued to uncover more financial irregularities. Every day, the numbers seemed to grow. Transfers to personal accounts, utility bills unrelated to HOA property, and loans that had nothing to do with community business were all laid bare. It became evident that the initial $20,000 was just the tip of the iceberg. Residents began calculating the full impact and were shocked to find that over $35,000 had been misused in total. The revelation ignited anger, a mix of betrayal and disbelief, but also a steely resolve to ensure that the president could not escape accountability. As the investigation progressed, committees began forming organically within the community. Homeowners who had previously never interacted began coordinating efforts. Some were tasked with gathering and organizing documents, others focused on communicating with auditors, and a few began drafting petitions and legal inquiries to prepare for the eventual removal of the president. The sense of unity among residents was unexpected. What had started as individual outrage now turned into a collective movement aimed at restoring the integrity of the neighborhood. Tensions escalated further during community meetings. Questions were sharp and pointed, and the president increasingly struggled to maintain composure. He attempted to justify some transfers as temporary advances or reimbursements for minor expenses, but each explanation was met with evidence contradicting his claims. Charts, invoices, and screenshots displayed clearly where the money had gone, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Residents leaned in, following every line, and their voices grew louder as frustration mounted. Some called for immediate legal action, while others insisted that every detail of the audit be verified before taking steps. The president, once confident and seemingly untouchable, began showing signs of panic. He missed scheduled meetings, sent last-minute apologies, and even attempted to contact certain residents privately to plead for understanding. These attempts were largely ignored, and in some cases, they only fueled suspicion. People began discussing the possibility that he might try to remove or hide evidence, and there was a shared determination to ensure that would not happen. Security measures were proposed to safeguard documents, and the community started monitoring access to financial records closely. By the end of the week, the community had shifted into full action mode. Flyers were posted, emails were circulated, and informal gatherings in backyards and driveways turned into strategy sessions. Residents discussed long-term reforms, including mandatory dual signatures on large payments, regular independent audits, and a complete restructuring of how financial oversight would be handled in the future. The betrayal had been shocking, but it had also awakened a previously dormant sense of responsibility and engagement within the neighborhood. The president's situation continued to deteriorate. Every attempt at public communication was met with scrutiny, every word dissected, and every explanation challenged. The combination of audit results, community engagement, and growing public pressure made it clear that he could not continue in his role. The neighborhood was no longer passive. They were prepared to act, united by a shared sense of justice and the desire to prevent any further misuse of community funds. As the week drew to a close, the community realized that their response to this scandal would define the future of their HOA. The $20,000 that had first sparked outrage was now part of a much larger story about trust, transparency, and accountability. Residents had been forced out of complacency and into action, and the coming weeks would determine whether the president would finally be held accountable or whether the community would have to fight even harder to reclaim its integrity. There was a sense of cautious optimism among the homeowners. They understood that this would not be quick or easy, but they also recognized that their engagement and unity were the most powerful tools they had to protect the neighborhood from future mismanagement. The scandal grew heavier as the days turned into weeks. What had started as an audit uncovering misused funds was now a full-blown crisis that dominated every conversation in the neighborhood. It no longer mattered whether residents had lived in the community for 20 years or had just moved in. Everyone was invested in what was unfolding. There was no escaping it. At the IN mailbox, in the park, even at the small convenience store down the road, people whispered updates about the president and the money that had gone missing. The president himself seemed to be unraveling. For years, he had commanded respect at board meetings. He had been polished, composed, and always ready with a quick explanation or justification for his decisions. Now that confidence had drained away. His words came slower, his tone defensive, and his once steady gaze shifted nervously when confronted with questions. At one meeting, when a resident directly asked how many personal bills had been paid with community funds, the room fell silent, waiting for his answer. His response was vague, avoiding the question, and it only fueled anger in the room. People began shouting over one another, demanding specifics, demanding honesty, and the board had to call the meeting to an abrupt end to prevent it from spiraling further. Behind the scenes, the president tried to cover his tracks. He contacted the treasurer privately, hoping to negotiate a way to reclassify certain expenses to make them appear legitimate. He suggested labeling personal transfers as reimbursement for administrative costs or miscellaneous community expenses. But the treasurer, who was already under scrutiny herself, refused. She had realized that associating with him would jeopardize her reputation, and she quietly informed the auditors about his attempt to alter records. That revelation was shared with residents, and it spread quickly, reinforcing the narrative that the president was not only guilty, but was also actively trying to manipulate the truth even as the walls closed in. The auditors continued their work, and the findings became more shocking. Not only had the president used community money for personal bills and credit card payments, but he had also been quietly authorizing payments to businesses connected to his relatives. Landscaping contracts were issued to companies owned by his cousin. Maintenance jobs that were supposedly handled by outside contractors had no invoices on file, yet payments had been made to a shell company linked to his brother-in-law. What had first seemed like poor judgment now looked like outright fraud. As these discoveries were revealed during community updates, the atmosphere shifted from frustration to outrage. Residents were no longer asking if the president should be removed. They were demanding it. Some called for immediate legal action, insisting that the board contact law enforcement. Others pushed for a recall election, believing the community should vote him out formally to demonstrate unity. A petition circulated, gaining signatures at a rapid pace. People who had never participated in community politics before lined up to sign their names, eager to see accountability brought to the person who had betrayed their trust. The president tried to fight back. He claimed the audit was biased, that the numbers were being exaggerated, and that the board members leading the investigation were motivated by personal grudges. He even attempted to portray himself as a victim, saying that the stress of managing the HOA had left him no choice but to borrow funds temporarily. But those excuses held no weight anymore. Residents had seen the documentation, and no matter how much he tried to twist the story, the evidence was irrefutable. Neighbors began organizing meetings without the board's involvement. They met in living rooms, garages, and driveways, sharing copies of documents and strategizing their next moves. Younger families who had been too busy with work and children now prioritized these meetings, realizing that protecting the community's finances was essential for their own futures. Retired residents who had once taken a passive role were suddenly at the center of discussions, drawing on their experience and offering guidance on proper governance. The community had become more engaged than ever before, unified by their shared goal of holding the president accountable. As weeks passed, the audit scope expanded even further. The auditors uncovered that some funds had been used to pay for personal vacations, including flights and hotel stays. The receipts were shocking, showing expenses for trips to Florida and California, none of which had anything to do with community business. Residents were furious when these details were made public. Parents pointed out that while the president was staying in beachfront hotels, their children were playing on broken swings and unsafe equipment. Seniors emphasized that while the president enjoyed fine dining on community funds, they had been forced to walk on cracked and hazardous sidewalks. By the end of the month, the pressure had reached a breaking point. The board could no longer defend the president, even indirectly. They voted to suspend him, permanently pending legal review, and a recall election was scheduled. The decision brought cheers from many residents, but there was also a sobering awareness that the damage had been done. Tens of thousands of dollars were gone, trust was shattered, and the reputation of the HOA was in tatters. Still, there was hope. The scandal, as painful as it had been, had transformed the community. People who once avoided meetings now showed up prepared, engaged, and ready to demand transparency. Neighbors who had barely spoken to one another before were now collaborating closely. The betrayal had united them, and as they prepared for the recall election, they knew the neighborhood would never be the same again. The president's days of unchecked power were over, and the community was determined to make sure no one could ever exploit them like that again. The news spread across the neighborhood faster than anyone expected. Word of the audit results went from house to house, and by the time the emergency meeting was scheduled, people were already whispering in driveways and texting in group chats. When the night of the meeting came, the small community center looked like it was hosting a festival. Cars lined both sides of the street, and people were practically pouring out of the building. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Usually, HOA meetings were dull, with only a handful of residents showing up. But this time, nearly every homeowner was present. Families brought folding chairs because there weren't enough seats. Some people stood against the back wall, arms crossed, waiting for answers. You could feel the anger buzzing like electricity. The treasurer, holding a thick stack of papers, cleared her throat nervously and began to read from the audit. Over the course of 11 months, funds totaling approximately $20,000 were withdrawn from the HOA account and used for personal expenses not connected to community projects or bills. A gasp rippled through the room. Someone shouted, 20,000? That's my property tax for an entire year. Another neighbor, Mrs. Ellis, shook her head and muttered loudly, and we were told we needed to increase dues because of rising maintenance costs. The treasurer continued, listing specific expenses, credit card payments, fancy restaurants, electronics stores, and even utility bills with the president's home address. Each line she read made the room louder with outrage. Finally, all eyes turned toward the president. He sat at the front table, pale-faced and fidgeting with his pen. When asked to respond, he sighed heavily. Look, I admit there were mistakes made. Some of those charges were personal, but I always intended to pay the money back. Things just got out of hand. That explanation didn't calm anyone down. Instead, the room exploded with voices. Out of hand? You stole from us, shouted a man in the back. You raised our fees so you could eat at steakhouses, added another. Even some of his closest supporters, who had previously defended him, now looked away in embarrassment. The president tried to raise his hands to quiet the crowd. I wasn't trying to hurt the community. It was a temporary loan. You have to understand, I was going through some financial struggles. No one here cares about your struggles, interrupted Mrs. Ellis sharply. We all have bills. We don't steal from our neighbors to pay them. The shouting grew so loud that the vice president of the board had to step in. He banged the gavel and announced, We will have order. The evidence is clear. We must move forward with a vote. The ballot was quick. Nearly every hand in the room went up when asked if the president should be removed from his position. Only 2 people voted against it, and even they looked uncertain. The decision was made. The president was officially removed from his role. For a moment, the room erupted into cheers. But just as quickly, the mood shifted to frustration again. A woman in the front row raised her hand. That's all fine. But what about the money? Are we just supposed to accept that it's gone? Another man added, We've been paying extra dues all year, and now we find out it was all wasted. We want it back. The board promised to consult a lawyer about pursuing legal action. A special committee was formed on the spot, made up of residents who volunteered to help oversee the process. Neighbors who had rarely spoken to one another exchanged phone numbers and emails, determined to stay connected. As the meeting ended, small groups of people lingered in the parking lot, venting their anger. I can't believe I defended him at the last meeting, one man admitted. I feel like a fool. He was smiling in my face the whole time, while spending our money on his electricity bills, another neighbor said, shaking her head. People were angry, but they were also energized. For the first time in years, the community felt united in a common cause. They weren't just angry homeowners anymore, they were watchdogs, ready to keep an eye on every dollar and every decision. But even as they talked about audits, new rules, and legal action, one thing was clear. Trust had been broken, and rebuilding it would be a long, uphill climb. And while the president was gone, he still lived in the neighborhood. That fact alone left everyone uneasy. The morning after the explosive meeting, the neighborhood was buzzing. It felt like everyone had been shaken awake from years of indifference. For so long, people had rolled their eyes at HOA fees and shrugged at minor disputes, but now the fraud made it personal. Every dollar mattered, and every homeowner felt cheated. Neighbors gathered in driveways, at the mailboxes, and even while walking their dogs. Conversations always circled back to the same point. What would happen next? Some demanded immediate legal action, while others worried about how long lawsuits could drag out. A few residents even wondered if they should organize protests outside the president's home to show they weren't going to let it slide. What made the situation harder was that the former president still lived among them. His house was only a few blocks away, and people saw him every day. That morning, when he walked outside to get his newspaper, 2 neighbors stopped in their tracks and stared. He gave a weak smile, as if nothing had happened, and quickly went back inside. The sight made people furious. Later that week, the newly organized committee held its first meeting. Unlike the usual sleepy gatherings, this one was full of fire. The treasurer laid out more details from the audit, and each piece of evidence painted a clearer picture of how deliberate the theft had been. It wasn't just 1 or 2 slips, it was a pattern of consistent misuse. One man slammed his fist on the table. That wasn't a mistake. That was theft. He knew what he was doing. A woman added, We trusted him with our community's money, and he treated it like his personal wallet. There has to be consequences. The committee discussed hiring a lawyer to pursue repayment. Some members wanted criminal charges filed immediately. Others urged caution, reminding everyone that lawyers and courts could take months, if not years. But even the cautious voices agreed. They couldn't let it go unanswered. Meanwhile, resentment grew in daily life. People began avoiding the president and his family. When his wife showed up at the community pool, several neighbors left early. Kids who once played together no longer got invited over. It was as if the entire neighborhood had quietly decided to cut ties. The tension finally boiled over one evening when the president tried to speak to a group of residents standing outside the community center. He approached them with a forced smile and said, Listen, I know everyone is upset, but I'm working on a way to repay the money. You have my word? One of the men, tall and visibly angry, stepped forward. Your word means nothing. You already lied to us for a year. You don't get to smooth this over with promises. Another neighbor added, We don't want to hear excuses. We want action. Pay it back or face the law. The president's face went pale. He stammered something about needing time before quickly retreating to his car and driving off. After that, the hostility only grew. People started documenting every sighting of him using neighborhood resources. If his lawn service came and was paid for, with what seemed like new equipment, residents snapped photos and shared them in group chats, convinced he was hiding assets. Trust was completely gone. The HOA board, under new leadership, began drafting stricter financial oversight rules. They created a system where every dollar spent would be logged, reviewed, and made visible to all homeowners. Transparency became the word of the hour. Still, there was no escaping the bitterness. At night, you could hear neighbors talking in hushed voices about whether the president would ever face real consequences. Some feared he would get away with it, that the legal system would drag on while the money disappeared forever. Others were more determined than ever to fight, even if it meant years in court. The community had changed. Before, it was just a quiet neighborhood, with the occasional squabble about lawn care or street parking. Now it felt like everyone was living inside a slow-burning scandal, and the shadow of 20,000 stolen dollars loomed over every conversation. And the worst part was, this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The weeks following the president's removal felt like living in a soap opera. Every day brought new whispers, new frustrations, and fresh speculation about what would happen next. For years, the HOA had been background noise in people's lives, something most homeowners hardly paid attention to unless fees were due. Now it was the center of every conversation. The newly elected board quickly set to work. They scheduled frequent meetings, opened financial records to public review, and set up a rotating system of oversight to make sure no single person could ever handle the money alone. The treasurer was practically living out of binders filled with spreadsheets and receipts, determined to rebuild trust one line item at a time. But for many residents, reforms weren't enough. They wanted accountability. Every time someone walked past the president's house, the sight of his well-kept lawn or his driveway, lined with new-looking cars, only fueled the anger. People felt as if they were staring at the evidence of their stolen money. One Saturday afternoon, a group of neighbors spotted him unloading shopping bags from his car. Without even realizing it, they gathered on the sidewalk, watching him. Finally, one man muttered loudly, "So that's what our money buys." The president froze, looked up at the group, and quickly rushed inside. The bags, filled with what looked like new electronics, only deepened the resentment. The community's group chat became a lifeline. Residents shared screenshots of bank statements, articles about HOA fraud cases, and even advice from friends who worked in law or accounting. Some neighbors became armchair detectives, piecing together timelines and trying to match every questionable expense with events from the past year. They noticed that around the same time money started disappearing, the president suddenly had new landscaping, new patio furniture, and his family went on vacation. The evidence was circumstantial, but in the eyes of the community, it was enough to confirm what they already believed. The board eventually invited a lawyer to a town hall meeting to explain the legal options. The lawyer, a calm man in a gray suit, stood before the crowd and laid out the choices. You can pursue civil action, which would mean suing for repayment. That process may take time, but if successful, you could recover a portion or all of the funds. Criminal charges may also be an option, but that will involve local law enforcement and the district attorney's office. The room buzzed with debate. One woman immediately shouted, "Call the police. He stole from us. Plain and simple." Another man countered, "If we press criminal charges, it could take years, and we may never see a dime back. Civil action might actually help us recover the money for 2 hours," residents argued. Some wanted revenge, others wanted restitution, and a few just wanted the ordeal to be over. But one thing united everyone. The president could not be allowed to walk away without consequences. Meanwhile, tension in daily life was unbearable. Children whispered about the scandal, repeating bits and pieces they overheard from their parents. The president's wife tried to maintain appearances, gardening in the front yard, or waving at neighbors, but almost no one waved back anymore. At the grocery store, residents avoided being in the same aisle as her. Then came the breaking point. One evening, the president showed up at a board meeting uninvited. He walked in with a folder of papers, claiming he had proof that some of the expenses were legitimate. The room went silent as he tried to explain himself. "These charges weren't personal," he said, flipping through receipts. "This dinner here? It was with a contractor we were considering for road repairs. This purchase? It was office equipment that I temporarily kept at my house." But the explanations sounded hollow. People had already lost patience. A neighbor stood up and said firmly, "If any of that were true, why didn't you tell us before the audit? Why hide it? Why wait until you were caught?" The president stammered, sweat glistening on his forehead. "I was overwhelmed. I thought I could sort it out quietly." The crowd erupted. Shouts of "liar" and "thief" echoed through the room. The vice president had to step in again, ordering him to leave until legal matters were resolved. As he walked out, someone muttered loudly enough for the whole room to hear, "You'll never be welcome here again." After that night, the neighborhood hardened against him completely. It wasn't just about the $20,000 anymore. It was about betrayal. People who had once trusted him to protect their community now saw him as an enemy in their midst. The board pushed forward with legal steps. They drafted letters, filed paperwork, and kept everyone updated. Residents volunteered to help with documentation, digging through years of records. The sense of community was stronger than it had ever been, but it was forged in anger and distrust. And yet, under all the noise, there was still uncertainty. Would they ever see the money again? Would the law side with them, or drag things out until the issue faded? And how would they live day to day in a neighborhood where the man at the center of it all was still walking the same streets, still waving from his driveway, as if nothing had happened? The answers weren't clear, but one thing was. The fight was only just beginning. The decision to pursue legal action was finally made. After weeks of heated debate and careful review of the audit, the board voted unanimously to hire the lawyer and file both a civil suit and a request for criminal investigation. It was a bold step, but by then, the community had reached a breaking point. Too much trust had been broken, and too much money had disappeared. The news hit the neighborhood like a second storm. Some people were relieved, cheering at the thought of accountability. Others were nervous about how long the case might drag on and how much more money it might cost in legal fees. But even the cautious ones agreed something had to be done. Doing nothing would have been the same as letting him win. A week later, a pair of police officers arrived in the neighborhood. They weren't there to arrest him, but their presence was enough to cause a stir. They knocked on the president's door, and neighbors peeked through blinds and curtains, whispering updates into their phones. The officers left with a folder of documents and serious expressions. By the next morning, rumors were swirling that charges might actually be filed. The president himself became a shadow of his former self. He no longer walked around the block in the evenings. He stopped attending public events. His once friendly smile had been replaced with a look of constant worry. But what unsettled everyone most was how he still tried to act like he was misunderstood, not guilty. In private conversations with a few neighbors, he claimed the whole thing was a witch hunt, that the board was overreacting, and that he was the victim of politics. But those excuses fell flat. No one bought them anymore. Every dinner, every so-called office purchase, every utility bill tied to his address told a story of betrayal. Meanwhile, the lawsuit moved forward. The lawyer worked closely with the new board to document every questionable expense. Stacks of receipts, bank records, and even old emails were compiled into evidence. Volunteers spent weekends scanning documents and organizing files. It was tedious work, but it gave people purpose. Instead of sitting in their homes, stewing in anger, they were part of a collective mission to take back what was stolen. Tension, however, didn't fade. If anything, it grew sharper. One afternoon, the president tried to attend his daughter's school event, but whispers followed him everywhere. Parents exchanged looks, teachers spoke to him curtly, and one mother quietly pulled her child away from standing near his family. For a man who once enjoyed a position of respect, the social isolation was crushing. Back in the neighborhood, some people pushed for more drastic measures. "We should put a lien on his house immediately," one man suggested at a meeting. "That way he can't just sell and run off with the money," another added. "And we should freeze his HOA privileges. He shouldn't be allowed to use anything until this is resolved." The board promised to explore those options, though they admitted it would take time. Still, the energy in the room was fierce. Residents weren't just angry anymore. They were determined to see justice through, no matter how long it took. Late one evening, a group of neighbors spotted the president sitting alone on his porch, staring out at the street. For a moment, it almost looked like he wanted to explain himself, but no one approached. The unspoken line had already been drawn. He was no longer one of them, no longer part of the fabric of their community. And as the first court date loomed, everyone knew the neighborhood would never be the same. The fight was moving out of their streets and into the courtroom. But even there, the scars of betrayal would follow them, shaping every interaction, every decision, and every ounce of trust in the years to come. The day of the first court appearance arrived, and it felt like the neighborhood had been holding its breath. People who usually never bothered with HOA politics were suddenly invested, eager to know every development. Parents walking their kids to school whispered about it at the bus stop. Retirees leaned on fences in the morning sun, trading theories about how the case would play out. When the date was announced, more than a dozen residents decided to attend in person. They carpooled downtown, filling the courthouse gallery with familiar faces. It wasn't just about watching justice unfold. It was about showing the judge and the lawyers that this community was united. For so long, the president had controlled the HOA in silence, making decisions behind closed doors. Now, those same neighbors were sitting upright in wooden benches, determined not to let him escape scrutiny again. The president walked into the courtroom looking smaller than anyone had ever seen him. His once proud posture was gone, replaced with hunched shoulders and a face lined with exhaustion. He wore a suit, but it didn't make him look respectable anymore. Instead, it looked like a costume, something meant to cover the truth. Behind him, his lawyer carried a briefcase, trying to project calm professionalism, but even he couldn't disguise the tension. When the charges were read, misuse of community funds, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty, the room grew quiet. Neighbors who had lived beside this man for years listened in stunned silence, even though they already knew the details. Hearing the words spoken aloud in a courtroom gave the betrayal a new kind of weight. The president's lawyer stood and argued that many of the expenses were legitimate or at least justifiable. He tried to paint the president as a man who had been overwhelmed by responsibility, who blurred the line between personal and community expenses, but never acted with malicious intent. It was a polished speech, but it rang hollow. Everyone in the gallery knew how deliberate the charges had been. They remembered the fancy dinners, the electronics, the vacations, all while the sidewalks cracked, the pool filter broke, and dues kept climbing. The prosecutor countered firmly, laying out the evidence with methodical precision. Bank statements, receipts with the president's home address, emails where he approved charges, with no board discussion. It wasn't just sloppy bookkeeping. It was theft, plain and simple. At one point, the prosecutor displayed a chart of the missing $20,000, breaking it down by category: gas bills, restaurant charges, credit card payments. The residents in the gallery leaned forward, recognizing some of the names of businesses they had seen him frequent around town. Whispers rippled through the benches. The judge eventually called for a recess. As the lawyers shuffled their papers, the residents filed out into the hallway. The energy there was electric. Some neighbors were furious all over again, muttering about how obvious the theft was. Others were relieved just to see the case moving forward. One man shook his head and said, "I can't believe I shook his hand at the holiday party last year, while he was stealing from us the whole time." The president walked past them with his lawyer, eyes fixed on the floor. A few neighbors wanted to confront him directly, but the lawyer kept him moving, whispering instructions not to engage. The silence between them and the man who had once been their leader was louder than any shout could have been. When everyone returned inside, the judge announced that the case would proceed to trial. There was enough evidence to warrant a full hearing. The gallery erupted in quiet cheers and sighs of relief. For the first time, it felt like justice wasn't just a dream. It was something within reach. Back in the neighborhood, that day became a turning point. Residents who hadn't been to the courthouse gathered at the community center to hear updates from those who had. People passed around handwritten notes and shared every detail they remembered from the hearing. It wasn't just gossip anymore. It was a movement. Committees formed to discuss how they could tighten bylaws and prevent any single person from having unchecked power again. Volunteers created newsletters to keep everyone updated on the case. What started as anger had transformed into something more permanent, a sense of vigilance. And yet, beneath the progress, tension lingered. The president still lived among them. At night, neighbors saw lights on in his house, a reminder that the man who had stolen from them was only a short walk away. Some admitted they avoided driving past his street, unable to stand the sight of his car in the driveway. Others deliberately drove by, almost daring him to look up from behind his blinds. The trial was still weeks away, but the neighborhood had already changed forever. Lines had been drawn, trust had been shattered, and the story of 20,000 stolen dollars had become the defining chapter of their community's history. And deep down, everyone knew that the courtroom was only the next step. The real fight for justice had only just begun. The trial began on a gray Monday morning, the kind of day where the sky seemed heavy and everyone carried themselves with a quiet seriousness. For weeks, the neighborhood had been waiting for this moment. The courthouse parking lot filled early, with residents arriving in groups, their conversations hushed but intense. Some carried notepads to jot down details. Others simply wanted to see justice in action. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. The president sat at the defense table, his lawyer at his side. He looked tired, his hair thinner, his face drawn. Gone was the confident man who once presided over HOA meetings like he was untouchable. In his place sat someone who looked cornered, like every movement was weighed down by guilt and fear. The prosecutor began with opening remarks, painting a clear picture of what the jury was about to hear. $20,000 misused, payments for credit cards, dinners at high-end restaurants, vacations disguised as community research, bills for his personal home utilities. The prosecutor's voice was calm but firm, emphasizing one point over and over. This wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. The defense countered with a very different story. The lawyer spoke of stress, of long hours spent managing community problems, of blurred lines between personal and board responsibilities. He tried to make the president sound like a hardworking volunteer who had simply gotten overwhelmed. He even suggested the missing money was much less than reported, claiming some of the expenses could be tied back to legitimate HOA needs. But when the witnesses began testifying, the defense's story started to crumble. The treasurer was the first to take the stand. With years of records in hand, she calmly explained the inconsistencies she had uncovered during the audit. She pointed to payments that matched the president's home utility company. She highlighted charges from restaurants where no other board members were present. She spoke clearly, every detail landing like a hammer. Next came a contractor who testified that he never received payments for work he had been promised. The community had been told the funds went to road repairs, but the contractor swore under oath that no payment was ever made. When the prosecutor held up a copy of the check, made out to the president's personal account instead, the courtroom gasped. Neighbors in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, some shaking their heads in disbelief. The betrayal felt sharper with each revelation, as if the wound was being reopened again and again. Then came one of the most powerful moments. A longtime resident, Mrs. Ellis, was called to testify. She spoke not as a board member, but as a homeowner who had paid dues faithfully for decades. Her voice trembled with anger as she explained how she had watched sidewalks crumble and pool filters break while being told there wasn't enough money in the budget. All the while, she said, looking directly at the president, he was eating at restaurants we couldn't afford and paying his personal bills with our money. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the judge seemed to pause before moving on. The defense tried to chip away at each witness, asking whether they could prove beyond doubt that every charge was personal. They questioned memory, challenged receipts, and tried to create small cracks of doubt. But the evidence was overwhelming. Too many expenses, too many connections to his home address, too many stories lining up against him. By the second day of testimony, the defense shifted tactics. Instead of denying everything, the lawyer began suggesting that repayment was possible, that the president intended all along to reimburse the community, but simply hadn't gotten the chance. It was a desperate pivot, and the neighbors in the gallery saw it for what it was. During breaks, residents huddled in the hallways, their voices buzzing with emotion. Some were furious that the defense was still trying to spin excuses. Others were relieved, convinced the trial was going in their favor. One man muttered, "He's cornered." They wouldn't be backtracking like this if they thought they could win. On the third day, the president himself took the stand. His lawyer coached him through answers, trying to make him sound remorseful. He admitted to using HOA funds for personal overlap, as he called it, but insisted he always intended to return the money. He spoke about financial pressures, about his family struggles, about sleepless nights, where he convinced himself it was just a loan. But under cross-examination, the prosecutor pressed him hard. Why were there no repayment plans documented? Why did the charges continue month after month, growing larger instead of smaller? Why did he never disclose his actions to the board until he was caught? Each question chipped away at his already flimsy defense. His answers grew hesitant, his voice weaker with every passing moment. By the end of his testimony, the jury looked unconvinced, and the neighbors in the gallery were simmering with anger. Mrs. Ellis whispered to the person next to her, "He's still lying. He'll never admit the truth." When court adjourned for the day, the atmosphere in the hallway was electric. Some residents hugged each other, saying justice was finally within reach. Others warned not to celebrate too soon. Trials could be unpredictable. But no matter what, they agreed on one thing. The evidence was too strong, and the truth was too clear. The trial wasn't over yet, but the community could feel the tide turning. For the first time since the scandal began, the hope of real accountability seemed possible. And as they prepared for closing arguments, every resident knew the next step would determine not just the fate of the president, but the reputation and future of their entire neighborhood. The final outcome of everything that happened with the HOA president did not come quickly, but when it arrived, it was clear and undeniable. After months of waiting, after all the meetings, after all the frustration, the court finally reached a decision. The president was ordered to repay the full $20,000 that had been misused, and he was barred from holding any future leadership role within our HOA or in any other similar organization. It was a strong message that no one could sit at the top of a board and treat community funds like their personal wallet. When the judgment was announced, there was a mix of relief and exhaustion among the residents. We had been dragged through months of paperwork, arguments, and tension with neighbors who at first refused to believe the truth. There were families who had stopped speaking to each other because of this conflict, and some people even thought about moving out just to escape the negativity. But in the end, when the money was ordered to be returned, and when the president was forced to step down, a quiet calm spread through the community. People finally felt like they had been heard. The new board stepped in soon after, this time made up of volunteers who truly wanted transparency. One of the first things they did was release detailed financial reports for everyone to see. Every resident could now look at the numbers, the bank statements, and the planned expenses. It was the exact opposite of how things had been under the old president, where everything was hidden and questions were brushed off as unimportant. This new openness started to heal some of the division. Neighbors who once stood on opposite sides of the argument were slowly willing to talk again. It was not instant, but it was progress. The sidewalks, which had been ignored while money went into personal bills, finally became a priority. Contractors were hired, and soon, construction crews were fixing the cracked paths that had been a danger for years. Parents could now watch their kids ride bikes without worrying about them hitting a broken slab of concrete. Seniors who walked in the mornings no longer had to step into the street to avoid tripping. Something as simple as a repaired sidewalk became a symbol of what the community could accomplish when the money was spent the right way. Looking back, many residents admitted that they had ignored warning signs for too long. They had trusted one person with too much control and did not ask enough questions. It was a lesson that hit everyone hard, but it was one that shaped how the neighborhood would operate moving forward. From that point on, people became more engaged. They showed up at meetings, they asked about budgets, they raised their voices when something felt wrong. The days of blind trust were gone, replaced by a new culture of accountability. Even though the community had been shaken, it also came out stronger. The scandal reminded everyone that the HOA was not some distant entity, but was simply neighbors working together. If they stayed silent, corruption could sneak in. But if they stayed involved, they could make sure that their dues were used to improve their lives, not someone's private expenses. For me, the most powerful moment came the day the new board announced the sidewalks were fully repaired and paid for with reclaimed funds. Standing there, looking at the clean, safe paths, it felt like a full circle. The money that had once been hidden in personal bills had been brought back and redirected to something that truly mattered. It was not just about concrete and construction. It was about trust being rebuilt one step at a time. The story of our HOA president misusing $20,000 became a warning tale that other neighborhoods nearby soon heard about. People called us to ask how we had uncovered the issue, how we had handled it, and what they should watch out for in their own communities. In a way, our long and stressful fight became useful to others, helping them avoid the same mistake. That gave all the effort a greater purpose. In the end, justice was served, sidewalks were repaired, and our HOA learned to never let power sit unchecked again. It was not the story any of us wanted to be part of, but it was one that changed us permanently. And it proved that even when leadership fails, a united community can stand up, demand answers, and take back control of its future. For more unbelievable stories, don't forget to like, subscribe,